Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're going to be playing some Atlantic Fleet again. In this video we will be talking about history, but just as you can see here at the start of this video, you can see we have 2 U-boats attacking a convoy of 7 merchants and 1 destroyer. We are in November of 1939 in our campaign, and so far things are going reasonably well for the German Reich. We are playing as the Kriegsmarine with the attempt to cut off British trade. But in this video, I'm going to have more of a historical discussion about World War II in the Atlantic. Again, this is another one of my videos where I'm going to be talking about the history behind the Battle of the Atlantic, and we will go from there. I do want to let you know that in our last video, we talked about the Battle of the River Plate, which took place in 1939, December of 1939. Now, we jumped a bit ahead for the history there because the gameplay video that we had was very similar to the actual engagement. And in fact, some of the cruisers on the British side were historically involved in that battle. So I thought it was a fitting, way to talk about the battle if the footage you were watching was similar to the actual battle that was fought. But in this video, we're going to go all the way back. We're going to set the groundwork for World War II and the Battle of the Atlantic from the German and British perspective. And in order to do that, in order to really understand the Battle of the Atlantic and the Second World War, you really need to take a look at the First World War first. Get it? First World War first. Yeah, that was dumb. Anyway, so going back, we really need to take ourselves all the way back to even before World War I to really understand the German Navy, the mindset of Germany, and the mindset of those making decisions in Germany in the run-up to World War II. So what we'll do is we'll go back all the way back to about 1900, and we'll start our discussion there. The story of the Battle of the Atlantic really begins in the early 1900s, and that's because some of the decisions that were made by the Germans in the lead-up to World War I really heavily influenced not only the submarine conflict during World War I, but also have lasting impacts all the way into World War II. If you look at early into the early 1900s, you see submarine technology, just like regular warship technology, is evolving rapidly. In the late 1800s, submarines began to become commonplace. Submarines using poor batteries or gasoline engines become very commonplace. Dozens of submarines are being built by the United States, the British, the French, but they're all very dangerous. Burning gasoline in a submarine was leading to explosions or toxic fumes. It was leading to killing submariners. It was a very dangerous proposition to be a submariner. But in the early 1900s, around 1902, you start seeing the technology advance in terms of propulsion. You start seeing kerosene or paraffin boats being built. And then in 1904, you start seeing diesel boats being built. And these are submarines that on the surface will use either kerosene or diesel to charge the batteries and power the engines. And then when submerged, batteries will be used to allow the submarine to maneuver without having to burn a oxygen-burning engine underwater, which would obviously create fumes and burn up all the oxygen and lead to a very short and grisly death for the crews on board. However, Germany, unlike some of the other powers, was really reluctant to embrace submarine technology. Part of this was Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. There was a strong reluctance from Tirpitz to support the submarine. He viewed it as a waste of resources. He thought it was a shortcut. Basically, people who didn't have the vision or the determination to build battleships would view submarines as an alternative that could be embraced as a cost-saving measure. And he didn't want anything that would divert from his intention of building a vast battle fleet. And Kaiser Wilhelm II really agreed with Tirpitz in this. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to build a battle fleet that was the equal of the British. He had an obsession with building a navy to the equal of the British. So building submarines seemed to fly in the face of these goals, because basically you would be diverting resources away from your battleships for an unproven, ungentlemanly warship that had dubious value. So what that meant is that, from the early 1900s, Germany was really reluctant to build submarines. The first German submarine, designated U-1, was commissioned in 1906. Germany was building submarines for other countries. Krupp was building paraffin or kerosene submarines for Russia and other powers. So German industry was being harnessed and was allowing them to continue to progress in the submarine technological revolution. It's just the German government was not taking advantage of that. In 1906, the U-1 was launched, and that made Germany the last major power to adopt submarines. And in many ways, many of the technological developments in these submarines was coming from America. The United States was in many ways in this time period the world leader in submarine technology and submarine designs. And as a result, that meant that while the ships were being built in Germany and German shipyards were very capable, many of the designs and ideas for submarine warfare were coming from the United States. Now, it's important to note that the U-1 was not a shift in German thinking. It was still viewed as a threat to the capital warship. It was still viewed as a diversion from German resources. But the thought was German companies were producing so many of these submarines and exporting them to other countries, and they were becoming such a hot commodity on the international arms market. Many countries were adopting submarines that they should at least build one of their own for evaluation purposes, so they could really evaluate the effectiveness of these boats and evaluate the risk that they pose to the capital warship fleet. The Germans were also the last when it came to adopting diesel engines. Part of this was due to a desire for better quality diesel engines. Many of the early diesel boats were very limited in their capability, but it wasn't until 1912 that the Germans ordered 23 diesel-electric submarines, and they became the last major power to adopt diesel submarines. At the outbreak of World War I, Germany had the smallest of the submarine fleets in service. The leader was actually Great Britain, which is odd when you think about how Great Britain was definitely a battle fleet oriented navy. But there you have it. At the outbreak of World War I, Great Britain had 76 submarines with 20 that were being constructed. France was actually second with 70 boats. Another 23 were under construction. Russia was third with 41 submarines. Most of them were obsolete, however. The United States was fourth with 31 submarines. Germany didn't come into place until you looked at the fifth place on the charts. They had 26 commissioned submarines and 15 more under construction. So the Germans, the only central power in the top five, were fifth, while all the other countries that would end up making up the Allies were far ahead of them. So I think that's kind of interesting when you think about you think of World War I, and when you think of the naval conflict, you think of sort of the major ship engagements like Jutland or Dogger Bank, but then very quickly after you think of the German submarine campaign against the British during World War I, and yet despite that, Germany was nowhere near where the Allied powers were in terms of submarines. Now, where the Germans were great was in manufacturing and technology. And additionally, the Germans had more targets, because when you consider the fact that the British might have had more submarines, and the Germans may have had the second largest merchant marine at the time, which they did. That might actually have been I think it was second. The problem that the British would have is that they had control of the seas, so their surface fleet would rapidly shut down all German commerce, and there'd be very little need for British U-boats. Now, British U-boats could also be used, and at this time period the idea was they would be used against naval vessels, but again, the German fleet stayed in harbor most of the time and only sallied occasionally, so unless the British submarines were on patrol at exactly the right point during World War I, their submarine fleet wouldn't have a whole lot to shoot at. So that's one difference, because the German submarine fleet, if it was deployed during World War I, would find a sea full of British warships, because the British surface fleet kept the Germans bottled up, which meant that the British had many surface vessels that were at sea. They also had many merchant vessels that were at sea, all of which could be targeted and attacked by German U-boats. Despite, however, being very far behind in terms of the numerical number of German submarines, the submarines that the Germans did have were largely modern because they didn't build nearly as many of the older technology boats. So in some cases, the fact that they were behind allowed them to be ahead in terms of a qualitative advantage. You weren't stuck with 10 boats that you built 10 years ago that were now completely obsolete, but you still felt like you had to keep around because they were still relatively modern, or new anyway. But some of this demonstration of the Germans' submarines' capabilities came early in the war, where in 1914, a single German U-boat sank 3 British heavy cruisers, the Abokar, the Hague, and the Cressy. Additionally, in another attack, 2 British light cruisers, the Pathfinder and Hawk, were also sunk, all of these ships with a loss of over 2,000 men. Now, some of these early attacks were due to the fact that the British didn't really know what was going on. Some of these ships were also very much obsolete. When the 3 British heavy cruisers were all sunk by a single German U-boat, these were old cruiser designs that were incredibly vulnerable to torpedoes. If you go back to kind of the pocket battleship era, often a single torpedo would be able to destroy these ships because they had virtually no protection against torpedo hits. Additionally, the ships would stop to pick up survivors. They didn't really know what was going on when the first ship was hit by a torpedo, so the other 2 stopped to help pick up survivors and offload people. So then they're just sitting ducks for the submarine. It goes ahead and launches more torpedoes, sinks a second ship, and then the third ship, still not really understanding what was going on, is still more or less a sitting duck for the submarine and then gets sunk itself. That's not going to happen in World War II. That's not going to happen later in World War I. Ships are not going to stop to pick up survivors and not have anyone harassing a submarine. Additionally, the Germans started in World War I to use their submarines against merchant ships. The problem was ships were expected to adhere to the prize laws that existed at this time, which basically required that the submarine stop the merchant ship and give the crew safe passage, or give the crew the ability to be considered safe. So they had to be within a certain range from the shore to be able to kind of be considered safe so that they could easily reach shore, or allow them to radio off a emergency message. Then they had to search the ship to actually verify that it had contraband. So not everything that might be on a ship would be considered contraband. You don't just sink ships without warning. You go through and you see, is this ship carrying war-making materials? Is it carrying shells? Is it carrying bombs? You could argue coal was a war-making material. The problems that the Germans saw when they started doing this, however, is that the British were not adhering to prize rules when it came to German merchants. The British ships on the high seas were stopping any German merchant ship, and it didn't matter if it had food, didn't matter if it had ammo. They'd either harass it, turn it back, or just completely block it from being able to make it to Germany. So, in protest and sort of retribution, the Germans started launching some unrestricted attacks against Allied merchant ships. The problem is, it's very difficult to sell blowing up merchant ships without warning and killing crew members when the British, while yeah, sure, they're harassing the merchant ships, they're not sinking these ships without warning. They're just turning them back. So again, it's a sort of a difference between the British being able to control the top of the sea and the Germans on the control of the bottom of the sea. But a public perception of sinking these merchant ships sailing through war-zone waters is very negative. And as a result, the Germans have a very back-and-forth submarine policy. At times, the Germans are adhering to prize rules, and as a result, that's getting some German submarines sunk. At other times, the Germans are adhering to unrestricted submarine warfare, which is getting the United States and other neutral powers very upset, as many of their citizens end up getting killed as they're caught in the crossfire and being in places maybe it would be wise not to be on a ship. And then the Germans will switch back and adhere to the prize rules to attempt to appease the Americans. In the end, it didn't work. At some point, the Germans ended up shifting over to unrestricted submarine warfare. The Americans declare war, but the Germans keep with the unrestricted submarine warfare, and devastating shipping losses are inflicted on the United States, or on the British. More than 800,000 merchant ship tonnage was sunk at one point during the high water mark in 1917 of Allied merchant ships. What this meant is that the British were essentially compelled to begin organizing their merchant ships into convoys. Despite the fact that the Admiralty was dubious of its ability to be successful, the British began organizing convoys where instead of one ship sailing alone or another ship sailing alone, you would have 20 or 30 ships all sail together in one pack, and you'd also have you'd have military escorts with them. This would make attacking on the surface incredibly difficult for the German U-boats, which was their preferred modus operandi. And then it meant attacking submerged or attacking at night. It also meant that submarines often would be on patrol for weeks and see nothing, and then all of a sudden you'd see 20 or 30 ships. Sure, maybe you'd sink one or two of them because you'd get your torpedoes out, but then you wouldn't be able to reload in time before the convoy was past you. And submarines by nature are very slow when they're below the surface. So what this really meant is that the German submarine force became far less effective. Convoys became very effective, and as a result, shipping losses declined dramatically. This basically meant that the Germans were not going to win the war with the submarine due to the shift to convoy tactics. Additionally, the Allies often knew where German submarines were because the Allies had intercepted and decoded German radio transmissions and were able to know oftentimes where ships were being ordered to. Ironic that this would really rear its head again in World War II, and the Germans would be none the wiser, but that's a story for another day. So what happens with World War I? I could go on day by day with a long kind of drawn-out account of the First World War, but I think I've given you a good enough summary of kind of the development of German submarines and the influence in World War I. Well, the problem that the Germans suffered was that they didn't have enough boats when World War I started. They were at fifth. So if you're going to go to a submarine campaign against the largest maritime power in the world, and in world history, it would help to have more than 20 boats. Maybe you'd have 4 or 5 on station at any point, but that's not going to starve a nation like Britain. Additionally, despite the vast shipping destruction, there was sort of this perception in Germany that we almost won the war through the submarine campaign. We were seeing success after success. Ship after ship after ship was being sunk, and we nearly brought the British to their knees. The reality was, despite the propaganda, and despite the fact that the British often were very terrified of the submarine threat, and maybe they overplayed it, the British were never seriously considering surrender. British civilians were never under serious restrictions in terms of rations or food or anything like that. As the submarine campaign hit its apex, a massive merchant and escort shipbuilding campaign began. And while it's probably unlikely, 1 million tons a month could have been replaced, it certainly would not have been a quick victory, even if things had continued to escalate. The Germans just didn't have enough boats. They didn't have the ability to have effective radios on board their submarines to deal with the new convoy tactics. The increased air cover by blimps, by balloons, and increasing number of escorts made the German submarines increasingly vulnerable, and their ability to attack on the surface was somewhat limited. Torpedo technology didn't advance far enough during World War I to allow the submarines to truly hide. These submarines were all launching steam-powered torpedoes that left a trail of bubbles on the surface, so you pretty much could always kind of track down where the submarine was, or at least get a bearing on it. So there were a lot of limitations. That doesn't mean Germany couldn't have won through a submarine campaign, but it does mean that the poor planning and lead-up to World War I and the number of boats that the Germans had, as well as the very inconsistent submarine policy where sometimes you had unrestricted submarine warfare, which was very effective, sometimes you didn't, sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't, meant that the German submarine campaign was really fighting an uphill battle. Despite all of this, there was a perception in Germany that they had almost achieved a great victory against the British and had almost starved the British out of the war. The problem is that was not true at all. And as a result, when it comes to World War II, you see this kind of coloring German thinking that, man, we almost had it. Why don't we just improve on what we did, do things a little bit differently, do things a little bit better, and then we'll definitely be able to do it. There was also a perception, especially during the Weimar period, the German Republic after World War I and before World War II, where the Germans kind of disregarded the Navy. They disregarded the surface fleet especially. There was this perception in Germany that we spent vast treasures on the German fleet in the run-up to World War I, and what did it get us? It got us an indecisive battle in Jutland. It got us a lot of smaller battles that we were defeated. It ended up leading to the revolution in Germany because the sailors were some of the first in Germany to participate in rebellions and revolts against the German government. And it just overall seemed like a huge waste of money. We spent all this time, we indebted our nation, we spent billions upon billions building one of the finest fleets in the world, and yet we weren't able to surpass the British. And yet, for a fraction of that cost, we could have built many more submarines, which did seem to be successful. It seemed that every time the high seas fleet for the Germans sallied, there was a defeat or a draw at best. Mainly the battle cruisers were the ones that sallied. Jutland was viewed as somewhat of a victory, but still. And then every time the submarines sallied, they came back with numerous victories. It almost seems like the German high seas fleet robbed itself of victory because of its obsession with battleships. And the German people paid the price because these vast sums were expended on the Navy that could have been used elsewhere. Maybe that extra money could have allowed the Army to win World War I. Maybe that extra money could have allowed there to be more U-boats and enough to turn the tide and win World War I. Who knows? That was kind of the thinking in post-World War I Germany. As a result, when it comes to World War II, and you start seeing the German Navy needing to build up, there's a very, very different reaction. Now, there's a few things that come into play. One of the things that you have to factor in is the Versailles Treaty. So after World War I, Germany was prohibited from building more than 6 battleships. They were only allowed to have 6 battleships. The battleships were limited to 10,000 tons. So that's where the pocket battleships come into play. That's why you have 10,000 tons. Basically, fast, lightly protected cruisers with battleship-sized armaments. But there also isn't really an appetite in Germany to build a massive surface fleet. There's this perception that, we tried that once. We already did it once. The fleet in being didn't really succeed, didn't prevent the British from joining the war. We probably could have occupied the British fleet with far less. We're limited here by treaties to what we can actually build anyway. But there really wasn't a perception of we need to build more, better surface vessels. There was a perception that we need to continue on with submarine development. So as you enter the sort of Nazi Germany period, where 1933 the Nazis seize power in Germany, and they begin to remilitarize and begin to rebuild the fleet, there was not a strong desire to do much with the Navy. The Navy was in ill repute. The Navy was part of the reason World War I was a defeat for multiple reasons. Again, one of the facts, resources were wasted on the high seas fleet. The high seas fleet contributed to the rebellion. The high seas fleet stabbed the German people in the back. There was not a high opinion of the German high seas fleet. What this did mean, however, is that during this period, the few people that were in the German Navy were of exceptional quality. The fleet was incredibly selective because it had to be, because it only had something like 15,000 members at one point. And that meant that everybody who was in the Navy was held to the utmost highest standards. Many people became discouraged as a result of this degradation of their public face. Many people viewed the scuttling of the German high seas fleet. After World War I, the high seas fleet sailed into Scapa Flow, and it was supposed to be turned largely over to the Allies, the victorious Allies. However, the Germans, in retribution, scuttled the fleet and sank it. Many in Germany viewed this as a betrayal of the German people. Maybe that fleet could have been used as negotiating leverage to make Versailles less hostile. But nonetheless, it was viewed largely as a stupid act, one that hurt Germany in the long run rather than benefited it. We had built this massive fleet, and we just went and blew it up. But again, what that meant is that in the lead up to World War II, the German fleet was of exceptional quality. Its surface vessels, its submariners, they were incredibly well trained. Rearmament and retraining began under the Nazis. There were some partnerships that were struck with the Russians, and the Germans began training their crews very effectively, and the people who were in the Navy during this period were the best of the best. It was almost like the Zero pilots in Imperial Japan, where there were only a few of them, and they were all basically aces, and they were all exceptional. So you had this exceptional cadre of soldiers to build your new fleet around as World War II begins to approach. And that's sort of the mindset in Germany in this period of time. They'd lost a world war, and the thought was the German high seas fleet played a role in that. The German High Seas Fleet was partially responsible for that, and basically we're not going to do that again. We're not going to build an incredibly strong surface fleet because it didn't work last time. Why would we try it again? At least that's what the perception was. And I think that'll be about it for this video as far as the historical discussion. I think what we can do in the next video, we can start to talk about German rearmament and the process of the fleet upgrading and leading into the early days in World War II. I hope you enjoyed this little discussion, mainly about World War I, kind of bleeding over into some topics about World War II. Basically just a really brief history lesson. Not a perfect one. I'm not an expert in the subject. A lot of what I'm taking is from the book by Clay Blair Jr., which looks at the submarine campaign between 1939 and 1942 from the German perspective. It's a absolutely incredibly detailed book. Highly recommend it. A lot of fun to read, very well written. But that's kind of where I'm getting a lot of this history. Some of it's from the internet, some of it's from my personal knowledge of other U-boat books I've read. Feel free to call me out if there's anything in there that I may have mixed up. I don't script my videos. I kind of talk about my topics. Sometimes I have a brief outline. This time I was going through some notes. But again, if there's anything in here that you specifically enjoyed or didn't enjoy, if this is kind of an approach you don't find entertaining, then please let me know. I'm always happy to change my approach. I know some people have said that my historical discussions can be a bit dry when they're more scripted. I was hoping this one would be a little bit more ad-libby while mixing in some scripting as well. But I'm interested in your opinion, so let me know your thoughts, guys, again in the descriptions. If you did like the video, go ahead and like it. If you disliked it, go ahead and dislike it. I don't have much of an update as far as the gameplay is concerned. You can see here we're attacking another convoy with submarines. It looks to be snowing. We're into the winter of 1939. So far, I feel like we're doing okay, but again, if the historical tonnage is what we need to shoot for, then we're definitely not winning the war yet. I think we're at like 30,000 tons being sunk a month, which is nowhere near. I mean, you're talking 800,000 tons a month at one point in World War I versus 30,000 tons here in these kind of opening months. We're definitely nowhere near where we need to be. On the other hand, I'm curious if that's really required because, again, in this kind of a game, it would be very tedious if those were the tonnage numbers you would have to sink in order to win. But anyway, guys, I hope you did enjoy the video. And if you did, let me know. If you didn't, let me know as well. I know I'm repeating myself there. But until next time, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, everybody for watching. And again, until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching. And until next time, I'm out.